Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. Welcome back to another episode of Maker That Money Podcast, live here on the YouTubes just about every Friday, 9 a.m. Pacific, with my good friend, Mr. Andrew Mayhall of 3D Gloop. I am Pooch of Repkord. That is my official moniker for these purposes. Welcome, everybody. Good to see you guys in the chat. Got some regulars. Alex, Grant, Mayhall, Asylum Life. Good morning to you all. I hope you guys had a great week and are excited to get into the details on problems and processes today. But before we do,
oh boy,
first we're gonna check in with Andrew. Andrew, how are you feeling today?
I'm doing good.
Yeah?
Tired from the week, but doing good.
It's interesting. I was thinking about this the other day. The fact that we have a 7-day week and that we've determined that 5 days is a normal, and I know that it's different for everybody. And as an entrepreneur, you don't always get the 5 days because we end up working over the weekend and stuff. But okay, why 5 of 7? Why is that a reasonable? You get 2 days to rest. There's got to be some interesting historical significance to the work week pattern. It probably goes back to labor organization and stuff like that.
It was Henry Ford here
was
in
it
the
Henry?
United States.
Was it Henry Ford that we?
It was Henry Ford. Yeah,
Oh.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, okay. So thanks to Henry. You guys can all thank Henry for the 5-day work week if you have a 5-day work week. We don't always have that luxury, but hopefully you get some rest and relaxation in at some point over the weekend and recharge for what's sure to be an awesome next week for you as well. I'm guessing it's never ending.
Yeah, absolutely.
Things are okay on this front. I got my coffee and I got a backup coffee. It's been a little bit chilly here. My propane service, so we're on propane here, ran dry, which it's not supposed to.
Oh, no.
Like, I literally pay for a service where they're supposed to just come and check and top it off as need be. And great time, dead of winter to just like run out of, so no heating, no hot water, and a couple angry calls to customer service. But so I got my coffee, and then I brewed a backup coffee because it's like my source of warmth right now, aside from my space heater that's cranking right here. But it was a nice balmy 48 degrees inside the house this morning when I woke up.
It sounds like you might need to invest in some of those like portable like propane tanks, and then just tap into your main propane tank.
So it's funny you mentioned that, because I actually do have like 4 or 5 of the grill size ones, and I mean, it's never advisable to but I do have like one of those blaster, heaters that you see for camping and stuff, where you just put it on the end of that.
The torpedo heaters.
Oh my gosh. Oh, the torpedo heaters, those are hardcore. No, I'm talking about more, it's more of like a radiant dish style, but that thing will put out some heat. Probably not advisable to run it indoors, but it hasn't come to that yet. Hopefully they're gonna get that emergency delivery out to me. I honestly, I can deal with the colder air, and I understand like it's all relative. Like, I'm in California, it gets mostly like just barely to freezing, maybe a little bit below in the winter here. I'm not dealing with sub-freezing temperatures and stuff like that. So
Sure.
I can deal with it, but not having my hot showers, man. That's like my one creature comfort that I need, and it makes me so grumpy when I can't get my hot shower. So I may just have to shower at the gym later. But you didn't tune in to hear about my pain from that. But I'm clutching my coffee. By the way, not sponsored. I don't know if are you a huge coffee drinker?
I mean, I drink coffee every now and again.
Coffee. I got myself for Christmas something called the AeroPress. Again, not sponsored. If you guys haven't tried this, I highly recommend it. I've been playing with different stuff, like doing pour overs. I don't like coffee machines typically because like the plumbing always just gets a little bit funky over time, and you're supposed to flush them with vinegar and do all this extra stuff. I wouldn't call myself a coffee snob, but I'm like, I want an easy cleanup, and I don't want mold in my life as much as possible. So I did some research. I tried this AeroPress thing, and it's supposed to give you like kind of an approximation of like more of an espresso cappuccino, where you're actually using
Okay.
pressure to drive
Sure.
through. So it's just a giant syringe and like a little filter. So you put the grounds in there, you put the hot water in, then you press it through. It's pretty simple.
Okay.
Takes 10 seconds to clean up. And it's so weird because it like same beans that I'm using. I love a dark roast. And
Uh-huh.
so I don't go like explicitly espresso roast, but really it's
Yeah.
just a function of how dark the roast is.
Mm-hmm.
But the same stuff I was using for my pour overs and the flavor is totally different. It's
Oh,
wild.
sure.
It's like it changes the acidity or something like that. So I don't know the exact science behind it. But
Yeah.
I've just
All about that pressure. It's all about
I
how
really
much
love it.
pressure. Yeah.
Well, and then it had me
Yeah.
thinking, I'm like, I need a little bit more because you want that crema, like that little
Yeah.
frothiness that you get, and you can't really quite get that with the pressure thing. So
Yeah.
this is, of course, how espresso machines came to existence.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
But I don't want a machine. I like my manual and simple cleanup and stuff like that. But I've been enjoying this very much, and it's very easy to make an Americano. I've never been an Americano person, really. But I seem to be now. So there you go.
Okay.
Greetings, Mike from Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada. That's his normal sign-in. I'm not that grumpy, Mike. I'm not that grumpy. We're doing good. Oh, good. Asylum Life, another vote for the AeroPress. That's good. I like that. Okay, so I'm not alone in that. So, there's a plug, something for you to try out. They're cheap, and if you're into coffee like I am, that's something to try. Okay, down to business. All right.
All right.
Let's get let's talk about today's topic at hand and why it came up. So, if you didn't notice, I did a tweet earlier. This is a shirt that I got from Tested. I bought this. They didn't send it to me. Like, I bought this shirt. Not sponsored again, but I love this. It's an Adam Savageism. And let me move my mic out of the way.
There
here
you go.
really quickly.
Yeah.
Just stand up. It is not a problem to solve. It is a process to manage. So Adam Savage, if you're not a fan of Mythbusters or Tested.com or any of that stuff, he is known for his interesting little wisdoms. My other personal favorite of his is I reject your reality and substitute my own. Which is a classic, and he's got others and stuff too. But this is a great one. And it spoke to me, so I immediately had to order it, and I sported it and did a post on Twitter earlier in the week on it. And it resonates with me specifically because it represents a lot of the things in my life as a small business entrepreneur that that I keep falling into. And you'll notice it's not that subtle, but the arrows of like the circular loop, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times the problems that we come across in life, in business, and everything are recurring. And sometimes it takes some time to like really understand and realize like the scope of the problem, and then try to find better solutions besides just like plug in the hole as it pops up, and before you know it, you're just overwhelmed, right? Like, why does the problem keep happening? What does this statement mean to you, Andrew?
Yeah, so that's it's an interesting one. To me, I think it really it says that a lot of the problems that we as maker entrepreneurs come across, we have a way of basically coming up with I can solve that problem with doing X, Y, or Z, and thinking that, oh, hey, you solved the problem. But in reality, like you were saying, you just plugged the hole in the dike.
Yep.
And it's a quick patch most of the time because we're focused on doing the next thing, right? Or chasing that shiny object.
Yeah.
And and then eventually it becomes a problem again. And it's like, oh, well, I did this, so that must be the process that I have to do again to basically fix the problem. And what I see it as is you get stuck in an endless loop. And if you're not careful, that endless loop can eventually lead to the whole dam basically breaking away and
you get
flooding
swept
your entire
down river and you're dead. Ominous. So tell me if this speaks to you guys in the chat as just humans, as small businesses and stuff, like thinking about the problems that you've had in your life or in your business and stuff like that, and are you just plugging the hole in the dike, as we like to say, or are you like actually identifying the problem and saying like, okay, how are we gonna make sure that this doesn't happen again? Um,
Hmm.
and I think that's more important in some aspects than the other when you think about problems that arise, say, in your customer service world,
Hmm.
right? Uh,
Sure.
that's probably one of the most immediately obvious things to us because it's like, okay, one person had this problem, two people had this problem. Okay, now we need to have some process so that these problems
Hmm.
don't continue to happen, so it doesn't cost us additional rework, customer
Hmm.
service time, all of that
Yep.
stuff. I think that's like a pretty glaring example, and it's sometimes it's good, and sometimes you need to live the problems. You need to experience them to
Hmm.
get the perspective. So we're going to do more alliteration here to identify problem and then create process. So by that I mean, um, you get so wrapped up in your own, if we're talking product design like we are for
Hmm.
some of our stuff, like the way that things should or should not be, and what's simple and intuitive to you and all that stuff, and it doesn't occur to you that people might use or try to put something together a specific way or whatever, and until you get that data, you don't
Hmm.
know what you don't know, and
Sure.
you don't even know that you need a processor up because you didn't even know it was a problem, right?
Yep.
It wasn't a problem for
Yeah.
you. Uh,
Yep.
I don't know. You probably come across stuff like that in your
Oh,
endeavors.
sure. Well, so it's interesting, right? Because for me, I'm a very process oriented individual in that
Mm,
I like thinking through all of the requisite steps, if you will, to either make a product or run a chemical reaction or basically build something. And it's a process oriented in that there's defined steps along the way,
sure,
and you have to complete these steps methodically. Maybe it's because of training in how you actually run chemical reactions, like how your reagents are added, how you document, how you engineer everything, from that nature. But in terms of like building a business, I always see it as a process. Like I see everything as a process. Like, oh, well,
mm,
first we got to do this, and then we got to do this, and then but that in itself can actually become a problem, because when you break things down into all of these individual processes, you can actually lose sight of the overall goal of what you're trying to actually achieve, and then you're just stuck in a process loop. So kind of think of this as like an endless bureaucratic loop that you go like to the DMV or whatever, where it's like, oh, you don't have this piece of documentation and this piece and this piece, and it's never ending.
yeah. Um, it's it's an interesting challenge sometimes to stop and analyze. Well, hold on. Let me step back a second. We've talked about technical debt in the past, and
Hmm.
and for those that haven't seen or sorry, haven't heard that episode before or whatever, technical debt are the things that you basically kind of put off in the hopes that you can deal with it later
Hmm.
because maybe you don't have the time and the energy to deal with it now. And I feel like it's very interrelated to what we're talking about here, where
Sure.
um, sometimes you just got to fix the problem, right? You
Hmm.
need to push a patch, like a hot fix in the software
Hmm.
world or something like that. But all too often, we fall into that trap of like, I just got to fix this right now, and
Hmm.
then you borrow against some technical debt and be like, we'll in the next revision we'll issue a more solid fix or we'll establish the
Sure.
process or whatever. And there's an argument to sometimes you just got to do what you got to do, um,
Mhm.
and you don't have the time to do the process piece.
Sure.
And I think I, in this day and age, tend to fall into this camp now where I spend probably more time anticipating that something is a bigger problem than it actually is, and then I rabbit hole into like establishing processes before it's like really a problem. So my question to you
Mhm.
is, how can we set some metrics for identifying the scope of a problem and
Hmm.
when you need to invest in the process versus what the
Sure.
pragmatic approach of like, let's just get that hot fix out there.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's an interesting question, and a really unique way to look at it. I would say that it's probably going to be really dependent on what it is that you're like, what the scope of the problem or process is. But generically speaking, yeah, in some cases, as I was mentioning, you can kind of get in your own way of starting to think about all of the different things that you need to do in order to get something across the finish line. And as you were mentioning, rabbit holing down and preventing yourself from actually taking that action.
Yeah.
Um in many cases, I think we have to try and take a step back and look at it from a different perspective of, okay, well, what just happens if I just get it done and just
Yeah.
try it?
Yep.
So I think really looking at the problem in such a way that uh if you're trying to identify how to prevent problems from arising, I think that's like kind of the red flag there of, okay, maybe you're thinking about too many things at once. Like, you're trying to prevent a problem from happening when you don't even know if it's actually going to be a problem.
Right.
So that's where you have a hypothesis, so let's
Mm-hmm.
test it. Let's
Mm-hmm.
just throw some science at the wall here and actually test it. And that takes stepping back and just seeing what happens.
So if I
If
were to
that
put
makes
a
sense.
yeah, no, it does. And if I were to put a step one on it, it's like, okay, like identify the problem or the magnitude of the problem, right?
Mhm.
And maybe try to get out of your own head. This is where like talking to other people, like walking through, like, okay, here's what I think this is a problem. Like, I think this may be a recurring
Mhm.
issue. I'll give you guys a great real world example of something we've been dealing with this week. We released a new design of the rep box. We use a thinner panel for certain parts of the box now, and we've had a couple reports from customers of breakage, specifically where filament has the exit holes that go out the box, and we have them in various places so that it's modular, so that you can
Mhm.
configure the box so you can put it under on a shelf and feed up to a printer or down or whatever. Um, and we thought like, oh, this design improvement is great because when you don't have an exit fitting in place, there's just a press fit plug that goes in the hole so that you
Mhm.
just don't have a bunch of Swiss cheese holes everywhere. And the
Mhm.
idea is that you pop out the plug, put it in a fitting when you want filament to come out. When you don't, you take the fitting out, you plug the thing back in. In the old version, the plugs didn't quite like seat fully, so over time they would sometimes kind of pop themselves out. They were just like a little nylon sheet metal
Mhm.
plug. uh in this version, they actually engage, like they press in and will like kind of the inner flange of the thing will kind of lock down. And that felt great because it was like, okay, hey, we get these don't pop out anymore. Okay, we have a but
Mhm.
what we didn't realize was going on was as people are trying to move stuff around and they're popping them out, once they've already put the box together, they're putting a lot of excess force to try to like press these things in or out,
Ah.
and it's causing breakage. And it didn't occur to us that that was a particular failure mode. And so it's like, okay, what do we need to do to what
Sure.
is the scope of this problem? So we had one
Mhm.
report last week, we had a second report this week, and we're like, okay, are we starting to
Sure.
establish a pattern here?
Mhm.
Is the fix like better awareness? I mean, obviously, we don't want to have to go back and redesign and go to a different, thicker panel.
Mhm.
We do like that the engagement of these plugs is different, but maybe if people are reconfiguring them more often than we expected, or not going about it the right way, or if the holes are too tight, like there's a
Too
number of
tight, yeah.
hypotheses
Mhm.
now that we need to like investigate to the root of this problem. And that's always painful when you just, you think you're improving things and now you're dealing with more customer
Sure.
service issues because there's breakage. And honestly, the customers have been great. They're like, I broke it. I was overly aggressive with it. But to some extent, we own the fact that,
Hmm.
well, we didn't have this problem before and now we do. So what do we do about it?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So
I'm asking,
that's
what do
a
we do about it?
yeah. So I think that what you've established now is essentially a repeat event, and so from there, that's the I
Well,
would say the
two,
second
twice.
signal.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, well, but it's still there's some it's not a fluke. And it happened in such a relatively close time frame that
Mhm.
one could then logically assume like, okay, if it happened within 2 weeks,
Right.
then maybe another week we'll get another one.
Right.
There's a pattern starting to form. It's too soon to say exactly how it's going to form, but so what I was saying is I think right now we can start to recognize the potential of a pattern. And so at this point, I think it is appropriate to say, okay, well, let's like do that step one, identify the magnitude of the potential problem,
Right.
and then try and start formulating. Okay, so if we know that the magnitude of this problem is going to be relatively large, like we might have to either issue a recall, like that's kind of like the worst sort of
Yeah. You said the
situation,
R word.
or yeah, or is it more something where we have to increase awareness? So now it's okay, we need to draft up a newsletter and contact the customers that ordered this, saying, hey, be careful or be mindful of putting this
Hmm.
in. And
Yeah.
then so this is where we're starting to establish, okay, what is our process going to look like? Because for one, we don't even have all of the data. So and then it comes down to, do we now need to start collecting data? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
And identifying that.
So, step one of the process v progress. Sorry, problem.
Mhm.
Issue is like the identifying the problem, the magnitude, the significance. Right. Like, get out of your own
Mhm.
head. Don't go. So, this may be a scenario where we did not consider that we had a problem, and now we're identifying like, oh, we do, and we're gonna have to figure out how to do that. What's an
Mhm.
example, Andrew, of a time where you probably, I'm putting you on the spot,
Sure.
um, feared that a problem was bigger than it actually was and spent too much time working on a solution that just really you didn't need to? Or can you think
Yeah.
of one of those?
I mean, there are a lot of different ones that that we've had here internally. One that comes to mind externally was when we started launching, our products, our we had an issue with I mentioned this several times before, the seals on our caps. And at
Mm,
first, we thought, oh my God, this is going to be such a massive issue. Like, we're going to have customers coming back, and we're gonna it's basically gonna put us out of business.
yeah.
What we realized, and so we started like doing a lot of research, a lot of testing, and spending a bunch of effort into trying to solve that problem. And what we realized was that the problem was, that ended up presenting itself was around 5 to 10% of the bottles that we actually sold, that a customer would actually experience this issue, which, yes, could be a pretty high margin, but are bigger issue in general. But what ended up happening is it allowed us to actually communicate with said customers and then make it right for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it
Mm-hmm.
gained us a lot more customer loyalty out of the entire situation than we would have actually thought it would have.
Yeah.
And from there, we had this issue, and it was a known issue, and then we made it aware, we made everyone aware, saying, listen, hey, if you have this issue, reach out to us. This is our process of how we actually go through and basically take care of our customers. So we established a process.
That's a
Um,
really good point. I want to hone in on this, guys, because I think this is really what separates the, what is it, the chaff from the wheat. What's the saying?
mhm.
Somebody, I botched that. But the things that you can take these potential problems and turn them into a major strength by communicating them, right? And
Mm-hmm.
short term, it feels painful, right? You're like, oh, if I have to issue this, like customers are going to get upset, or there's going to be that swath of customers that are going to probably not really
Mm-hmm.
have the issue or have not contacted you, but because you had thrown out that you're going to replace it for free, then of course they're going to take advantage of that. And so you're having to send out an additional product. So you really have to look at your outreach as kind of
Mm-hmm.
like a long tail thing in terms of establishing brand trust, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so
Yep.
that which feels immediately painful, Andrew's not. We talked about the R word, issuing a recall,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes it can just be fishing for data in terms of like, we are aware of this as a potential issue. We want you guys to know that we're looking for it. We take it seriously and all that stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
those things go a long way in terms of winning over your customer loyalty. So
Mm-hmm.
that can be leveraged in a way that can be beneficial, and maybe you can get ahead of the game where you might catch it before it becomes a problem for other people and
Mm-hmm.
before they get frustrated, because for every customer that you're hearing from that has a problem, there's probably a non-zero sum that are out there that
Yep.
non-zero amount that are out there that just never contact you, and they're just frustrated and they just won't ever buy from you again, right?
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
you, when head that off at the pass, you're potentially winning some back,
Mm-hmm.
which can be a good thing. But I know that feels painful because you're creating more work for yourself and all that stuff. So you have to evaluate those things and balance them. So in the
Mm-hmm.
identifying of the problem, you kind of said, well, it really wasn't that big of a problem,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe it's worth, doing this. And maybe at the size of your company you were at right now, it's worth doing. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's not. Like, I can see different people sitting around in a meeting arguing over the merits of both approaches.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for
Yep.
anything less than 5% or whatever, or 2% or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, it's just, we'll just deal with it as it arises, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I was on a hangout with I see Zombie Hedgehog and Liz are in here earlier in the week, and it was discussed about 3D printing, Chinese 3D printing manufacturers, and how a lot of them don't even have a good process for like sending spare parts.
Sure.
They are so working on optimizing like an inexpensive machine that they will oftentimes just send a whole nother machine whenever, when they need to, which seems completely
Ah.
wasteful and
Yeah.
ridiculous. But that is the volume approach to customer service a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the time, where it's just like, well, we don't really have a parts department and stuff like that, and the machine's cheap enough and we'll just send you another machine so that you have it. And so uh
Sure.
I've had that happen to me before with I want to say it was like an artillery printer or something like that, where it was just like, we'll just send you another one, you can have it. And I didn't particularly like that resolution, because like I didn't want
Sure.
to just take apart another perfectly good, like harvesting one printer to get one part to make the
Yeah.
other. Well, obviously you're just you end up getting a full other working printer, and so there's no point to
Yep.
taking one part off of another to make the other one
Yeah.
work. You
Well,
may as
of
well just
course.
use the new
Yeah.
one. And so now I've got a junked, or one that still can't be fixed or requires something else. And so you're left kind of to your own devices to figure out what to do. Like, maybe the problem was solved in the sense that like you got what you paid for again, but now you've got
Yeah.
more waste. I don't know. Let me know in the
Sure.
chat if that's ever happened to you guys, and like how strange of a solution that feels. I don't feel like it made me happier though, like in the long run. I mean, yes, I got another printer. Like, I didn't end up with like, I paid for something and then I had a broken printer that was never fixed.
Sure.
But I didn't feel like my problem was really fixed. I don't know. Is that weird?
Interesting.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
bit of a
That's
digression.
an interesting one.
Yeah, that's a bit of a digression. But anyway, that was interesting. Oh, James, NorCal Machine Works, good to see you. Sorry you're late. Listen, your penance, go stand in the corner for 2 minutes and think about what you did, and then you can come back and chat some more with us. But he did mention identify problems if the problem is a pattern that is native to a lot or the design. Now that's an interesting one, right? Like,
Mhm.
is it a fundamental
Yep.
design flaw when you're identifying the problem, or is it specific to the production of a specific lot of them? And that's a really good point, right? Like,
Mhm.
when you're breaking down the problem, like, not you know not making assumptions about whether it's a fundamental design flaw, or you need to spend the time to
Mhm.
do some analysis. And
Yep.
it's very easy to fall into that trap of like, does causation equal correlation? Like, there's plenty of
Mhm.
variables that contribute that may lead you one way or the other, and that's kind of an art to identify.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so you got to put on that sleuthing hat to figure it out sometimes, huh? Other comments. Mihao had one earlier. He had a question, and I think I don't know if he was saying it simultaneously because we were talking about technical debt. He said, would technical debt be the opposite of the process that we're trying to balance in the two? So technical debt is when you don't
Mhm.
create the process. So yeah, I
Yeah.
suppose we are talking
Yeah.
about the opposite of this. Like, we're saying, like, okay, here's how we prevent
Mhm.
taking on technical debt, right? By creating
Yep.
processes to identify problems.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about identifying the problem. If you guys have
Mhm.
other tips and tricks in terms of what's worked for you, and like figuring out, sleuthing out the problem, like, please share.
Mhm.
But let's move on to solutions. So
Okay.
we've figured out the scope of the problem, whether it's your cap problem or my whole plug problem, or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, and I think there's some cost analysis that's obviously
Mhm.
happening, right? And that oftentimes is kind of this intermediary deciding factor in terms of, like, there's the gold standard fix, and then there's the fix that we can afford to do. Like, maybe we can't afford to recall everything. Like,
Sure.
how do we make as many people as happy as possible without, like, stopping costing the company an insane amount of
Mhm.
money, right?
Sure.
And
Sure.
thankfully, we're not dealing with product recalls that result in people dying, like the automotive industry or something like that, where there's
Mhm.
like a human toll,
Yep.
that factors in. But cost is a significant part of the evaluation, is it
Mhm.
not?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Mm.
Um,
So give us the
you know,
formula, which is so we can just plug in numbers, and then everybody can just go about their merriment.
unfortunately, I don't think there's just a single formula that you
Uh,
could use. I mean, for us, we had to take this into account for when we had the issues with the seals and the old caps. And part of the thing that we identified when we were looking at the problem was, oh well, we need a new cap. And so
mhm,
we spent tons of time, tons of energy, tons of testing developing our own cap, and the intellectual property around it. And like you buy a new bottle of Gloop, it comes with a really fancy purple cap on it. And that we actually designed here in house. And part of that came from, okay, well, we have to eventually stop the bleeding of just constantly replacing bottles or constantly replacing product that has gone bad over time because of that.
right.
But we couldn't at the time, since we were bootstrapped, we couldn't afford the upfront investment to get that mold made and have all of the
Mhm,
parts necessary
mhm.
to actually do that. So what we did was internally, we literally built out an Excel spreadsheet of saying, okay, well, this is the past day that we've had. This is the future day that we expect. Here's our current growth rate and trajectory that we think we're going to be able to sell our products to. So we're going to have to start budgeting X number of dollars per month that we're just going to have to eat to replace this product that has gone bad because it was a known issue. And so what we did was we created internally a formal process, literally an if this then that sort of follow up,
Ooh,
where when a customer would come to us, we would then look at it, look at their order, figure out,
mhm,
like
mhm.
basically, does it qualify? How do we make this right, if you will?
Yeah.
Um,
So we have some interesting commentary in the chat about in the subject of
mhm.
costing and evaluation. Chemnerd process that I think he's talking about. There's discussion about the Harbor Freight replacement program. Like, their
Okay,
policy is
sure.
like, the stuff is so cheap, the logistics is more expensive of like dealing with the parts thing that just
Mhm.
shipping another one is cheaper and more cost effective. And Kemner goes on to say, like, somebody made the decision that it's just
Mhm.
more cost effective for us to send a replacement. And that is I think it is becoming a more, or it already is a common
Mhm.
solution to these
Mhm.
problems, right? Like when you look at the overall cost, the evaluation has been it's just cheaper to just deal with it as it arises.
Mhm.
And instead of going through a design analysis or whatever, accepting the fact that there will be X percentage failure rate
Mhm.
and then just ship another one when you need to.
That's exactly
It
it.
is a wasteful one,
Mhm.
unfortunately, but that is part of the cost, I guess, associated with it. Um, and it is a solution, and it is a
Mhm.
very business solution, right? Like, what's going to
Mhm.
cost us the least amount, and then we do that. Um, I would argue that the long term cost
Mhm.
of that is probably higher
It is.
in the lost brand reputation, right?
Yep.
Or but
Mhm.
maybe that's okay. I don't know. People that are shopping at Harbor Freight for tools don't really
Mhm.
care, or they're going there because they want the cheap one, right?
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
they just need something that works right now or is going to work for this season or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, so it just really depends on where customer expectations are, right? But
Sure.
you're gonna have a hard time climbing out of that hole of like establishing yourself as like a top tier brand, and maybe that's not important to
Mhm.
you. Maybe you're a value player. I don't know. I mean,
Yep.
that's what we see coming out of China a lot of the
Well,
time.
exactly, and so you brought up this excellent point. Like over time, it basically it doesn't loop. At some point, it's a spiral, and each time you keep adding more and more product, and eventually, if you have this you as a company are growing, you have more and more issues that you're having to solve. And so this is something that again, as we defined this process, we actually realized saying, okay, well, at some point, this is going to start costing us a lot more, and eventually it's going to damage the reputation, it's going to damage the brand, it's going to damage everything that we've been building up to this point. So while at first it gave us a really nice touch point with the customer, and it allowed us to make the situation right, and they loved us for it, it also potentially, if they kept having this issue, means like, man, I don't even want to bother with it, because then I'm gonna have to reach out to them, and then they're gonna have to replace it and all of this other stuff. And so once we realized this problem, again, it was like, okay, now we have to start implementing the process to fix said problem,
Yep.
and defining that, and getting to a point where we're better. And so we released our V1 of our caps, and our V1 right now, that's what everyone gets. They still have issues. We've still had issues. Granted, they're a lot less,
Yeah.
but we didn't get it completely correct at the first go around.
Right.
And so it's, this is one of those things where there's like two loops inside of each other, like recursive, problem process loops that we're actively working on.
Yeah. I I struggle with this one because it's like as a business, business me is just like, yeah, of
Hmm.
course you're gonna do what like customer service and having a parts department and all the things required for like issuing a fix and getting somebody through that like is really
Hmm.
time intensive and costly and all that stuff. But like I just wish that it wasn't such a wasteful approach. Like the reason that nobody fixes anything anymore, like, and the reason
Hmm.
things are designed to not necessarily be fixable is because the cost benefit analysis has shown that over time that it only is going to have a useful life of X, period of time, and that it's just cheaper to like
Hmm.
send another one as needed and then fix it in the next design. Like, okay, we take in the data, we understand that, that's fine. And when the next version of the tool comes out, hopefully we design it so that this doesn't have the problem. But in the
Hmm.
interim, you just have to accept the fact that there's going to be some failure rate and you move quickly. So there is an argument for it does allow you to fail fast, right? I guess in that
Hmm.
regard. Um,
Yep.
and maybe investing in shortening your release cycle time or optimizing your production in a way where you can release improvements faster that is a
Hmm.
process improvement.
Hmm.
um but having done plenty of that on a simple storage box, I can tell you like that can be painful, as well. Every time a new release comes out, there's such a domino effect of what
Sure.
other things have to happen, and it's really hard to get a good aggregate of the true cost of that. A lot of times, like, it doesn't become apparent for a while.
Sure.
You know, where do we go from here? We need more tips and tricks. For we've identified our problem.
Mm-hmm.
We're working on implementing a process now. You'd mentioned my
Mm-hmm.
tweet earlier was, more money, more process, right? Like, because the more products you have and stuff like that, like you said, the
Sure.
more this comes into
Mm-hmm.
place. And so as you grow as a company and you start investing in that, you have to really, really start focusing more on having not just the process, but the people to support the process,
Sure.
for
Yeah.
that growth. So
Sure.
the releasing another product, and you've seen this, right? Like, you started with
Mm-hmm.
PLA Gloop, then you had PETG, and then you've got other ones that you
Mm-hmm.
want to, but that even just small, subtle formulaic changes like
Mm-hmm.
require completely different processes sometimes. And that's not,
Mm-hmm.
the end user's just
Yeah.
like, well, this one says PLA, this one says PETG, and doesn't tell
Yep.
the story at all, in terms of, like, you might have to
Yeah.
use completely different reaction vessels and whatever,
That's
chemistry
exactly it.
to
Mm-hmm.
to
Yeah.
to get there.
Yep. Yeah. And for us, like, yeah, it comes down to, we're still really small. Like, Gloop is still two people, and we want to move on and start releasing new products or new chemistries. But we also have to, as I was saying earlier in the show, like, I'm very process oriented. So we have to come up and establish the processes of how we actually produce said products, how we bottle said products, how we label it, everything. And it's been a chore. And so one of the things, like, that we've recently been doing internally, is getting ready towards serialization, and that requires a whole new change to our process, like how we label our bottles,
Yeah.
how we actually track all of the batches, how we track all of the lot numbers of our bottles, our seals, everything.
Yeah.
And that requires, again, a whole new change of just thinking through, and eventually it's going to require another person
Mm,
to actually help us implement said process.
mm,
Now, this is one of those things where it's, you go back, it's not a problem, it's a process to manage. It was for us, like, we had to issue a recall, 6 months ago, something like that. I can't remember exactly when. But it was because we had a problem that we weren't properly process managing. That was keeping track of our vats of our various reagents and what their usable shelf life was. And in this case, we had some contaminant get in, and in our case, it was moisture and water, and it
mm.
ruined that reagent.
Yeah.
And we weren't carefully managing that process of making for sure, like, we were storing it correctly, or ensuring that we were using it before it's in shelf life.
Yeah.
And it basically resulted in us having to issue a recall.
Mm-hmm.
And so that actually changed quite a bit of what we did internally. Um, so I think part of the, one of the tips and tricks is, we were mentioning earlier, was identifying the magnitude of said problem. Like,
Right.
at this, this was it was a known unknown, if you will.
Mm.
In that, if you're thinking about all of the things that could go wrong in your business, you have some known knowns where, like, okay, hey, you got chemical things that are going to go bad, right?
Right.
Like, you
Right.
can predict something like that. You then could also say, well, maybe someone adds the wrong chemistry and, causes a bad batch to happen. But you have other things where like known unknowns. Now, that sounds a little weird, but the
Yeah.
idea is that you don't know exactly what could happen that would cause an issue, but it causes an issue that in which you're going to have to issue a recall, or you're going to have to, change process. And so
Sure.
from there, identifying all of these pieces and listing them out in, I guess, a level of severity,
Mm.
so that you could then define, this is what would happen if this were to happen. I know I'm not really providing a lot of specifics here, but I guess just really trying to provide some structure of thinking through.
Yeah, this touches on a lot of interesting things that have been talked about earlier in the chat and stuff like that too, where you when we're going back, you need to identify, like, is this a fundamental design? Like, your chemistry was sound.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know
Mm-hmm.
that you can get the result you need. So it's not a design thing, but you had a lot issue because something went wrong in your process.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking now about you are changing your process so that you have some serialization, some identification so that you can
Mm-hmm.
identify this. And as James at NorCal Machine Works points out, that a lot of times insurance actually requires this, or certain, like when you go brick and mortar and stuff like this, like having those
Yep.
labels and stuff is a requirement because of the fact that if a recall needs to be issued, the retailer needs to be able to go through their shelves and be like, yep, this falls in this cereal range. We need to pull this stuff off. And
Yep.
so when you're first getting started, obviously you didn't have this process, and it was, I guess, arguably a technical debt that maybe you knew you would
Mm-hmm.
eventually need to get to, but it wouldn't have
Yep.
been worth necessarily spending the time and money investing from the jump without knowing if the demand was even there, right? And so
Sure. Yeah.
these are the things that we constantly come across as a small business, where it's like, you, until it becomes a big enough problem, you don't move to that next step. So this can be a rite of passage and a good thing,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
you have to prove out a lot of other things before you're going to invest the time and money and energy in, establishing that process.
Yep.
um, because it does you no good. And we've seen just, history is rife with failed companies that probably try to cover too many bases too early on without even identifying if they have a viable product,
Mm-hmm.
which is
Yes.
a conversation for like a whole nother time. I think, I don't know. I don't know that there's data on this, but I would speculate when you get into the world of like venture funding and stuff, where it's like
Uh-huh.
you've got all that money burning a hole, you've hired these people, you're hiring people with experience, with wearing goggles of, well, we need to do X, Y, and Z because that's what I did at my last company. Never mind, it was a
Mm-hmm.
multinational, multi-million-dollar company that had the resources and the demand
Mm-hmm.
to drive all of that. And so you're starting to get, move down this path because there's just money to throw at this problem.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that, I feel like, that can be a great disservice. Like, that's a great reason that bootstrapping is great.
Mm-hmm.
Like the fail fast thing, the don't
Mm-hmm.
invest in the problem and the fix until you are there. But
Mm-hmm.
I know that where there is amorphous, and all that stuff. And so that really, I think the moral of the story, as I would wrap it up, and you tell me, is that the identification of the magnitude of the problem is
Mm-hmm.
critical in the
Yep.
whole thing, in terms of identifying the cost benefit analysis of implementing that. I know that's like a lot of
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's
things.
exactly it. I mean, we could have, like, for instance, on the specifics with our batch, numbering or serialization, we could have implemented a serializing process, but it would have meant that at the beginning, like, we would have had to have gone to a different label supplier. We would have had to have serial numbers printed on the bottles. We would have had to invest in software and in, equipment capable of supporting all of that. Like, I can share, like, use some numbers recently. We've invested almost $20,000 in this whole serialization
20K.
effort.
20K,
20K.
guys, in
Yeah.
just the serialization effort. And
Mm-hmm.
how does
Yes.
that feel? Tell us in the chat. And again, this is no judgment on Andrew and how he spends his money, but it is. What does that feel like to you at this, at where you're at, in terms of like a dollar expenditure for a specific process? Because I
Mhm.
guarantee you there's people out there like 20K, that's nothing. And then there's other people
Sure.
like, oh my God, 20K, like I could buy da 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 da, I could do this with that, right?
Mhm.
And so you're
Yep.
constantly, especially as a bootstrap, you're constantly evaluating the do I want to spend it on this or do I want to spend it on that? Right.
Mhm.
You have determined that to grow, to
Mhm.
have presence in brick and mortar and all that stuff, like, you need to cross this bridge, and this
Yep.
is an investment that's worth making. I'm glad you brought up software,
Mhm.
uh, because that's part, what you were talking about for your serialization. Because we did get a question from Vast CNC that I wanted to address, where he says, where do software tools and solutions come into on process improvement? And specifically, he's asking about inventory and what do we use. So
Mhm.
I think the first part of that question is a great example. Like you just gave an example. That's a piece of software and a piece of hardware
Mhm.
that you've had to invest in and
Mhm.
train on and all of that stuff. But inventory is
Mhm.
is my white whale right now, or is one of many of them. And we've played with things because there's a ton of ERP, MRP, like there's so many solutions your head would spin in terms of like inventory management, process management, tools. There's
Mhm.
companies out there that are constantly trying to sell you things and all that stuff. And that's one of the ones where I'm like, we're not there yet. We don't need it. Like my ops director, came from HP, and he's been looking at ERP systems. Oh, I think we should use this
Mhm.
and that and the other thing. And I'm like, man, we don't have the money to spend on that, nor do we need like 80% of the complexity that thing even has. Like we are still in spreadsheet
Sure.
land. And we're
Yep.
not even doing that well, but that's more because of like garbage in, garbage out problem, not because of the tool itself. Like we're not regularly,
Mhm.
because so much of inventory or any software is about data entry, not the
Mhm.
software itself. So if you don't have the process for consistent data entry, it doesn't matter what the software is.
Sure.
What are your feels around both the question of software and specifically inventory? Because I think inventory can relate to anybody. Even if you're not selling product, a lot of times you might have
Mhm.
work in process, or maybe your inventory is more of a
Mhm.
digital inventory of sorts. I don't know. What do you?
Well, yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, like for us going through this whole process, improvements for serialization, there are a lot of changes that we have to make, and how we actually go about doing those. And so, as I mentioned, the software, but we now have, a whole piece of, we have a whole like suite of tools that we now have to like learn to use for inventory control, because with serial numbers, and we start producing bottles in a serialized fashion, we have to make for sure that it's a first in first out sort of situation, where we're sending out the bottles that we're producing in a linear fashion, not jumping lines and getting things confused. Yes, it could happen where eventually it gets down to the reseller or whatever, and they're selling out of order. But for us, we have to produce in a methodical way, and for inventory pieces, like it's that's a huge it's a huge problem for us to solve right now. And that's where a lot of this focus has been recently, on coming up with new product SKUs. Like we even have
Mm-hmm.
SKUs now on every individual piece that goes into the products. Like our caps
Our
consist of
SKUs
like
have SKUs. Yeah.
our SKUs have SKUs. Like
Oh,
our
jeez.
caps consist of like around 8 components, and they're actually assembled in house. And so from there, we have everything now is going in bins, and they all have SKUs, and we're establishing a process in such a way where this is the progression of the production of a cap, and we now have it a documented way so that we can then put batch numbers and basically a gated control of the production of all of these items.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
so yeah.
This is a tough one to address because it's so specific to what your particular
Hmm.
problem may be or what your product is, and so what's good for the goose is not necessarily good for the gander here. Like,
Hmm.
going back in, there's a lot of little sub debate on usage of spreadsheets versus databases and stuff like that. Yes, they are not the same thing.
Hmm.
And by the same merit, I would say like maybe a spreadsheet. So a spreadsheet, I would say, is a step above like a clipboard and a piece of paper, right? So like there is a
Hmm.
very fundamental accounting inventory structure of like literally just walking through and be like, I have 5 of these, I have 6 of these. Okay, a spreadsheet now is a digital representation. I say we're in that land, and the reason we utilize that is it's the minimum viable product for us that allows us to share remotely and digitally. Like, so it's a connected spreadsheet. We're using Google Sheets so that somebody can go through, do a count, and I can be at home, and when I'm doing my purchasing, I say, okay, we got this many on hand, so I don't have to physically have that thing ahead of me. Like, but it's a very
Hmm.
rudimentary approach to inventory control. There's a lot of blind
Hmm.
spots still.
Yep.
Um, But I would argue for where we are, for the money that we have, and the choices that we have to make with how to spend our money, I am forcing us to stay in that space because
Hmm.
it's what's most appropriate for our needs currently.
Sure.
That's not an easy thing. Like, a lot of people are like, oh, well, if we want to be legitimate, we got to be using Salesforce or, all these other things that are going to tie our manufacturing back to our sales channel. And, like, it gets wacky, guys. Like, it gets expensive. And don't get me wrong, like, there's value in these tools, but you have to really
Hmm.
step back and go, do I have the people that can even manage all of this? Do I have the time to train everybody on it? Like, don't put the cart before the horse. um
Hmm.
and that's so easy to do in this world,
Sure.
because you go, well, I want to invest in doing it right now, right? Like, I got into this, I don't want to say debate, but like, my ops director, we're working on packaging for a product we just launched, the turntable,
Hmm.
and he was just like, look, we were just kind of debating on, like, how do we want to kit all these parts together? Like, there's no one right. This is kind of organization. Do we put
Hmm.
all the screws in one bag? Do we separate things out? And there's the things that make our life easier in terms of, like, getting the package out and to the customer, because
Hmm.
we don't need to create a separate baggie for different things. And then there's, like, the cost associated with, if we just threw all of our parts into one box and somebody opens it up and then just a million pieces go out and they're having to hunt it down, it's a crappy experience, right? When you're expecting to put it together. So you have to find that balance of, you're kind of creating some organization and some, coaching, and
Hmm.
that's unique to kitting, or
Hmm.
kit build type products. You don't deal with this if you're
Sure.
shipping fully assembled things to people. It's not
Yeah.
a problem that you have. His argument was, let's just go with, like, we need to get this thing out the door. We already have orders coming in, all that stuff. We'll come back and optimize what the build process should be, and what, get the baggies all have the proper labels on them and all that stuff. So there's constant debate around, like, taking on technical debt versus, like, no, I know that we're gonna get wrapped up in something else next week. We're not gonna come back to
Sure.
this. So let's take
Yeah.
the time now and let's do it right. What I'm considering right,
Hmm.
because let's be honest, like, it'll change again at some point. But let's invest in establishing some process now, and that takes some feel, right? Because
Hmm.
Pooch of 1-2 years ago might have just said, yeah, you're right, like, let's just get this thing out the door, and taken on a lot more technical debt than I'm willing to take on now. um I'm the one that has to hear the customers complain about the fact that they lost a bunch of screws because they just, like, dumped the thing out and didn't expect everything to go everywhere. And I'm like, no, that's a crappy
Yeah.
user experience. We're not doing that. And to be fair, he wasn't necessarily advocating for just, like, throwing it all in one thing, but we were just kind of talking about, like, how far do we want to break it out. He actually probably went further, where it's like everything was its own bag, and we were going to need all this extra plastic bagging, all this extra labeling, and I
Ah,
was like, you know
sure.
what, we can probably move. It ended up being a compromise. We can probably put a couple things together in this bag and a couple in this bag, and so, at the end of the day, it was a compromise, the way a lot of these things were, and I'm happy where we ended up, and I don't think it was a lot of extra work. But again, the way that
Sure.
I address my problems and the processes that I create are not
Hmm.
necessarily what you do, and at the end of the day, you just need to decide something, right?
Sure. Yep.
That's the last thing I want to hand on, because this is the paralysis by analysis is
Hmm.
a major problem for a lot of entrepreneurs
Yes.
and all that stuff. At the end of the day, you need to make a decision and go forward. You might be wrong, you might be right, you might be somewhere in between, but not doing anything or spending too much time on
Hmm.
meetings and discussing is not good
Yep.
either.
Yep.
That, I think,
Absolutely.
is a core component of establishing problem process and all that stuff. Like,
Hmm.
pick something and go with it, fail fast maybe, and reevaluate. What is your advice or strategy in that?
Yeah, so I would say that, and I am 100% guilty of this. We've done this on several products that we have not released yet because it's not ready yet, or we need to establish this process in order for it to be complete. I mentioned earlier, like, it can be very easy to get wrapped up in, if you're a process oriented individual, where you have to take certain steps in order to manufacture a product, and you think about all of these things, and you're thinking about all of the problems that could be. You basically get trapped, and you're not able to make a decision, because or you're waiting on something else in order to be able to make that decision or take that next step, and then you get stuck in this holding pattern. And it's like, well, I can't do this because I need to do this first, and I need to get this first done because I'm waiting on this, and it becomes a problem in its own self, because it's a process and it's in its way. So like I was saying, like the
Yeah.
endless bureaucratic kind of stuff that you would deal with, like with government entities or
Yeah.
whatever. It's
Yeah.
like, well, you have to fill out this form, and then this form, and then you have to wait 6 weeks, and then like kind
We
of
have
like
to have a
that.
meeting on it, and then we
So
have to have another meeting on it.
exactly. And so what I would say is the first sign of that actually happening is when you make that first excuse to yourself of, I can't do this right now because I need to make this so that it's done right. And I feel like that is the first sign. It's like, well, internally, like as you just said, Pooch, like you might not go back and do it, again,
I know
but you're
myself.
this idea of it's got to be right is I think where it all gets rooted.
So
Um,
is that a
you know,
semantics thing? Because I find myself saying that all the time. We're gonna do it
yeah,
right. We're gonna do it right the first time. But like
yeah.
that is where the
It,
problems lie,
and it
right?
might be a
Like
semantics, but
yeah.
yeah, I mean, the point that I'm trying to make is like, we internally was like, well, we're not going to release this product until we know that we can support it, and we know that we can do all of these things. And like, we
Mhm.
were thinking way too far down the road. And what we needed to do was actually just get the dang product out there and just see if it actually worked.
Yes.
Um,
That's the fail
and
fast. That's the fail fast mechanism, right?
exactly,
Right? Or
exactly.
hopefully
And
succeed
so
fast.
we we got caught up into this, and it was like, well, we're not going to do it until we can do it right and the correct way. And
Yeah.
it's like, well, we're the ones defining what is right and the correct way, and we're the ones standing in our own dang way right now in this position.
So right, you're absolutely correct in the sense that right is probably a terrible word to use in this case. I think a
Hmm.
better process for that is like define the criteria, because where we fail
Sure.
a lot of the time is what is the release structure, or like it's I don't think that it's bad to say that like we can issue that as a V. That could be a great V2 option. That could be a good
Hmm.
V3 option and stuff. But we don't take the time to define what problem are we solving with this
Yep.
particular product or process
Hmm.
that's out there. And I oftentimes like to look at use 80/20 rule, right? Where it's
Hmm.
like, here are all the things that we think, based on what we know customer demand is, we would like to have right now. Here's what's feasible based on the money we've got or the time we have available or whatever. Can we hit 80%? Like, where's the sweet chewy center of these
Hmm.
things? But we don't
Sure.
always take the time to like lay that out, because a lot of times we do it, and it's not until we're iterating on the product and all that stuff, and we're like, you know what, this would just be really killer extra feature if we just rolled this in too, like that creeping elegance, that shiny object syndrome that ties back into this whole thing, that just
Hmm.
ultimately fights against you in terms
Hmm.
of like committing to a choice.
Hmm.
So that's a bit of a digression into product
Sure.
development, not necessarily identifying the problems and stuff, but like again,
Hmm.
spending that time to whiteboard or write down your notes or whatever your process is to understand like where are you even trying to be,
Hmm.
and then committing to a course of action that at least is going to hopefully check off as many of those things as you can, knowing that you're
Sure.
never going to get them all right.
Hmm.
Like, what are the ones that
Hmm.
what are your deal breakers?
Hmm.
And then sometimes you have to have discussions like, well, is this really a deal breaker, or is it just like that's what makes it right to me does not necessarily make it right
Sure.
to you? So
Sure.
defining what is right, getting it right,
Hmm.
is really where the devil lies in that detail.
Yeah. Sure.
I don't think that tells anybody anything specific, but I mean, other than what we constantly say, which is like spend the time to actually analyze the problem, write down things,
Hmm.
like think, stop, just stop,
Yep.
man, just
Yep.
stop and apply some thought. Um, and that in and of itself works against a lot of what's like part of the reason I got into being in business for myself was like I just hate the notion. I hate the way the corporate rat race is and like how much time was spent in like meetings and talking about what we're
Oh,
gonna do but
yeah.
never doing it. Like I started my own business to get out of ever being in meetings, and now I find myself getting dragged back into meetings to some extent because it's
And
just
sometimes you need to
inevitable.
create a meeting to
Just,
establish another meeting. So now we're setting up
um,
meetings to create meetings.
it's just so yeah. But I mean, you know, like that's been kind of the way that in corporate America we've just like, well, this is what it takes to have those discussions or to get a thought process down. The problem is like those aren't well defined oftentimes, and they get
Mhm.
bloated, and a lot of people don't realize like that could have been an email. You know,
Yeah.
meetings. None of us is as
Yeah.
dumb as all of us. Uh, yeah. Well, we could go on for quite some time
Mhm.
on this, and maybe we should revisit it at some point. I do hope that you guys got some useful thought nuggets. That's a thing
Hopefully,
out
yeah.
of this. We always enjoy having the conversations. I always leave these feeling energized, and you have to understand, guys, like this is for us as much as it is for anybody else in terms of like our methodology of talking through things. Andrew and I think have a very like simpatico around like what it takes for us to kind of like identify things that
Mhm.
we need in our point. So half of it is us venting and sharing things that have worked and not worked for us. And so I hope that has value to you guys. As Mike likes to say, if it does, please don't forget to subscribe. Bring a friend, whatever. Give us suggestions about topics you want to hear more of. We love your questions. We love your comments. Feel free to call in if you ever want to. The hotline is above. It's all about conversation. It's all about trying to get to a better place together. And we thank you for joining us as always. Andrew, parting words for
I mean,
our people.
I mean, I guess just uh, get out there and I guess go do something, right? Instead of
Do
worrying
it.
about all of the problems, just do it and see if there are problems instead of, you know,
Is that the best
instead of
data?
getting worried.
That's your best advice, like in terms of like you just got to collect the data, right? And
Mhm.
sometimes it's
Mhm.
not the data that you want, but you're right.
Yeah.
Like if you don't, the cost of the cost of inaction is oftentimes greater than the cost of your actions, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
you know, training yourself to like yes, have some time to talk about it, but define that period of time. Define the length of the
Mhm.
meeting. Define like we're going to think about it for 30 minutes or an
Mhm.
hour or whatever it is, and then implement. And
Yep.
and
Just
then
do it.
assess, right?
Yep.
And it is a circular, but that's the whole key to establishing a process. It's
Mhm.
scientific method, right? It's like you have a
Yep.
hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, you might refine the hypothesis and then retest and until you get it right. Like that's what
Mhm.
we're doing. We're making the
Yep.
recipe as we go.
Absolutely.
Hope that's helpful. Awesome seeing you guys. Please join us again next week, next Friday, 9 a.m.
Mhm.
Pacific, right here on the YouTubes for another captivating episode of Maker That Money podcast with Pooch and Andrew. Until then, everyone have a fantastic weekend. Best of luck to you. Keep tacking up those wins, which I know we missed today, but we'll talk about more next week. And enjoy. Bye bye.